Welcome, everyone. This is the PartsVu Xchange Talks Boating podcast. Here we chat about all things boating with marine industry professionals and enthusiasts who spend all the time they can out on the water.
Hi, this is Tanya Becker, and I'm your host for today's episode of PartsVu Xchange Talks Boating. Today I'm joined by Captain Frank Lecardo, the owner and an instructor at the Naples School of Boating. We're going to geek out a little bit and talk about E-Perps, related emergency communications technologies, and how to select the right devices for your needs. This technology is really fascinating, and as we were preparing for this episode, I found myself going down a lot of really technical rabbit holes. It probably would have made for a really boring podcast, but I included links to some of those resources in the show notes in case you find them interesting like I did. First, let's clarify what an EPIRB is. Many of our listeners likely know that EPIRBs are critical for search and rescue, particularly essential for offshore boaters. Every time we talk about offshore boating on this podcast, though, I always point out that offshore boating on the Great Lakes should not be underestimated. Every safety precaution that you take for offshore boating on the ocean needs to also be taken for offshore boating on the Great Lakes. Frank, I'll stop rambling and let you explain to our listeners what EPIRBs are.
Well, thanks for inviting me back on the show, Tanya. I really appreciate it. One of the topics that I always cover when training new boaters is being prepared for the type of boating that you're going to do. And so I really like the comment you made about not underestimating the mighty Great Lakes. They're really not to be messed with. They are inland oceans. Again, EPIRBs, if we can just kind of jump into it, EPIRBs stand for Emergency Position Indicating Radio Beacon, and they're used to alert search and rescue services in the event of a life or death emergency. Okay, it does this by transmitting a distress signal from your EPIRB to a satellite, which then transfers the signal to Earth stations called rescue coordination centers. It's important to note, though, that this system should not be used if you break down and you need, sea tow or towboat US. Unless, of course, that situation becomes a life or death emergency. So I just want to make sure we understand this. These devices are used for serious rescue missions.
The network these devices work on is called COSPAS SARSET. I had to look up how to pronounce that. COSPAS SARSET. It's an international collaboration. It's up and running 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And just to give some people a frame of reference a bit, in 2021, 263 people so far have been rescued by the network. 143 of those people at sea. So it's kind of amazing to think about. This just began, and it began as I said, as an international collaboration in 1979, and worldwide over 48,000 people have been rescued. By this network. I wanted to create this episode to talk about EPIRBs and how to select the best one for you, but also to clarify some of the differences between common emergency communication technologies. Specifically the differences between EPIRBs, personal locator beacons, PLBs, and automatic identification systems, or AIS. There's some really important differences to understand. Can you help break this down a bit?
Absolutely, Tanya. This can be a bit confusing even for experienced boaters. So first, let's talk about PLBs, or personal locator beacons. PLBs work the same way that EPIRBs do. They send a coded message on the same distress frequency. The most important difference is that EPIRBs are registered to a vessel, whereas a PLB is registered to a person. Okay, so that really is the most distinct difference. This means that if you switch to a new boat or you decide to use a friend's boat, the PLB will still be correctly registered to you. EPIRBs, on the other hand, would need to be re-registered if you buy a new boat. And if you decide to rent a boat or use someone else's boat, you wouldn't just be able to take the EPIRB from your boat, because then, of course, if you did use it, it would send a distress signal describing a vessel that isn't yours. So that could actually lead to more trouble. So you will need to rent an EPIRB, which you can do quite inexpensively. I believe Boat US Foundation offers them as an example. So that's the first thing to consider when deciding between the EPIRB and a PLB. So let's turn our attention now to the EPIRB. If you choose an EPIRB, the next decision you'll have to make is whether to buy a manual or an automatic deployment unit. An automatic EPIRB must be mounted in a place on your boat, where if the boat were to sink, it can automatically be released and float free of its bracket. Once it does that, it begins transmitting your distress signal. So a manual EPIRB, on the other hand, means you physically have to pick it up and turn it on in order to activate the distress signal. So, the key to making the right decision here is really looking at the mounting requirements for that unit and deciding if you have the appropriate place on board the boat to mount it. I can tell you that the vast majority of smaller boats, let's say under 40 feet, would probably end up, being better off with the manually activated EPIRB. Some people stow them either in a storage locker down below in a cabin where they know all the rest of their safety gear is, or some people just have, a distress bag where if they know they're going in the water, they grab the bag and everything that's in there is what they need. So it really depends on the boat. It really depends on, whether or not you have a place to mount it. Okay, so if we can turn our attention back to PLBs for a moment, which are obviously much smaller units and much more portable, it's important to note that they can be used not only on the water, but, for also land adventures like hiking or skiing. So if you're an active outdoors person, maybe you have a small boat, maybe you wander into areas where you don't have cell phone coverage, or maybe you're, out of VHF radio range and you just want that added peace of mind, then a PLB might be the right choice. But if you're going, 50 or 100 miles offshore, I'm going with EPIRB. So, but yes, and also you should consider the waterproof rating of some of these PLBs. Some may or may not be, and others may actually come with a floating sleeve. So, it's something to investigate a little bit before you make that purchase. The other thing I want to mention is battery life. PLBs, once they're activated, will transmit for a minimum of 24 hours and can be stored for 6 years, which is a pretty good battery life. The EPIRB is a little bit better battery life, actually. It's typically about 10 years with 48 hours of transmission. So the EPIRB is definitely a bigger size battery, but it's also a bigger size unit. So battery life is something to consider. And, by law, PLBs cannot be designed to be automatically activated. So a PLB by default is just going to be a manually activated device. All right. They're more mobile. They're more likely to be dropped or mishandled. An automatic activation feature, honestly, on something like that might send unnecessary search and rescue teams just by accidentally deploying the device. So that's not something that we want. So
that makes tons of sense. It never really even occurred to me. Of course, I've always associated these devices with offshore boating. But of course, PLBs are extremely useful and used by commonly, backcountry hikers and like backcountry kayak kind of activities and so forth. I just didn't think about it. And it makes sense. That's kind of where some of the confusion, I think, between PLBs and EPIRBs come from. So, the final layer to this kind of emergency communication discussion, technology discussion, is chatting a little bit about automatic identification systems, or AIS technology. An AIS is a digital VHF radio based transponder system that can prevent collisions. Can you explain some of a bit about AIS technology? And is AIS technology a replacement for EPIRBs?
Well, that's a great question, Tanya. AIS is somewhat like a digital radar as far as, it does give precise position information. AIS uses a combination of GPS, VHF radio, and sophisticated digital processing to sort of automatically communicate between vessels without any operator interaction. However, only vessels with transponders can be seen. So if I'm on the water on my boat and I don't have an AIS transponder and I'm not sending out an AIS signal, boats that have AIS receivers aren't going to know that I'm there. Is it a replacement to radar? No. Is it definitely a useful tool? Yes, absolutely it is. That's really the most important thing to understand, that, if you have a radar unit, on the other hand, if I'm out there on my boat and I don't have radar or AIS and I'm just sitting out there in a canoe, well, your radar is going to spot me. As long as I'm an object above the waterline, it's going to pick that up. So radar operates just much differently, and it doesn't require the other vessel to have a radar to be seen. So an important distinction on that one. But I could tell you, I've done lots of boating in New York City. And if you have AIS on the boat, you almost have to turn it off because it's beeping constantly with all the ferries and barges and everything kind of running around. So anyone who's been through New York City and has AIS on their boat, they'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It's almost distracting and confusing because there's just so much activity. But it really is neat because at a glance, even without radar turned on, I can know all the commercial vessels that are around me for sure.
That makes tons of sense, but it is not. It's a very different technology than EPIRB or PLB technology in that it's designed to prevent collisions, not for search and rescue.
Yeah, AIS technology is designed for vessel-to-vessel communication to avoid collision. It's extremely valuable technology, and it can be a standalone unit, or in most cases, it's usually included in VHF or GPS chart plotting units. So most of the time on more modern electronics, it's going to be included. But if you have older electronics and you still want AIS, you can buy a standalone unit for it.
Okay, that makes tons of sense. So with all this established, how do boaters select the right EPIRB or PLB devices for their boat? I mean, how do you recommend them go about considering this process?
Well, if I can just take a quick step back, I just want to mention one thing to our listeners, that while extremely valuable, it's also essential to know that AIS technology does not communicate for search and rescue purposes. So I just want to reiterate that. So if you're using AIS, that's not something for search and rescue. I know it's again great technology, but I just wanted to make sure we put that out there. And as far as choosing the right EPIRB, as I mentioned before, most people with a small recreational boat will opt for a manually activated EPIRB, not just because of the mounting issue, but also cost and maintenance. Automatic EPIRB brackets have to be serviced and or replaced every couple of years. I believe it's every 2 years. So not only are they more expensive to purchase, but now we have an additional maintenance item. So, honestly, you can go on PartsVu.com and you can get yourself an excellent manually activated EPIRB that requires no maintenance for 10 years at around $500. And to me, at that price point, I honestly think that any boater going offshore, or more importantly, out of VHF radio communication range, can really afford to have this life-saving technology. So I think for $500, it's a really great investment, and I wouldn't worry too much about having it be automatic. If your boat is in distress, most people are going to have a few moments to grab that EPIRB and turn it on and get their life jacket. So I think I'd rather have a manual EPIRB than no EPIRB at all. So
makes complete sense. The other thing I think boaters often get a little confused by is the registration processes. VHF radios have to be registered, EPIRBs have to be registered, both numbers, they're both two separate numbers, right? I mean, how can you clarify for people?
Yes, and thank you for bringing this up. A common question that I hear from customers has to do with that red distress button on their VHF radio. Your VHF radio can also be programmed to transmit a distress signal that's coded with your vessel information. The way to do that is by registering your VHF radio with what's called MMSI, or Maritime Mobile Service Identity Number. The important thing to remember is that VHF is a line of sight communication tool. So that means if your antenna has to be able to see the other antenna, otherwise it can't talk to it. This is limited to about 10 to 15 miles, depending on atmospheric conditions and antenna height. But an EPIRB or a PLB, on the other hand, works anywhere in the world because it relies on satellite communication. So it's an important distinction. If you're going offshore, you can't just rely on your VHF radio because, again, you have a distance limitation with that. So the EPIRB or the PLB will also have a registration process, which is very easily done online. The instructions will be included with the purchase of the unit. You can also go to my website, naplesschoolofboating.com, and visit my blog page. I have instructions there for registering both EPIRBs and VHF radios. But yes, they have to be registered. It's kind of the same process, but a different number and a different website that you're doing it with.
Yeah, that makes tons of sense. And I can see where the confusion comes from, but it's pretty easy to sort out the difference between the two, I think. So thanks so much for being here today. I mean, it's been a great conversation. And I know, since you're based there in Florida, your busy season is getting ready to start soon, right?
Yes, the phone's ringing. I had 7 new customers sign up last week. But I'll tell you, Tanya, what I'm really happy about is that boaters are smart enough to know when they need help, and they're smart enough to know what they don't know. And the good news is they're seeking the training that they need. So I'm really happy to see that. People are taking boating more seriously, I think. And obviously, with the pandemic, we've had such an uptick in boaters, new boaters. And I'm really happy to see that they're reaching out. They're asking for help and advice. They're asking for training. So glad to see the phones ringing.
Oh, absolutely. And insurance, I mean, you and I have had this conversation, just some telephone calls over the last few months, but insurance companies are increasing the level of training that they're requiring too, I believe, right?
Yes, they are. I'm starting to see people call me and say, well, I just bought my first boat. My insurance company says I need X number of hours of on-water training with a captain. So the good news is I made the effort to make my program very official. And it actually adheres to a national standard of on-water training. So insurance companies like that because those standards were established by the Coast Guard and NASBLA, which is the National Association of Safe Boating Law Administrators. So the insurance companies tend to like that because this isn't just some captain out there winging it when making a training program. It was done, intentionally to serve these people and serve them well. So they tend to really like my program.
That's awesome. Well, thanks again for being here, Frank.
Thank you, Tanya. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. And just so everybody knows, Naples School of Boating serves Southwest Florida, including Naples, Fort Myers, Marco Island, Sanibel, etc. Frank says he does a lot of on-the-water training for new boaters, as well as people just working to increase their boating skills. And if you want to learn more, check them out at naplesschoolofboating.com. So thanks again, Frank.
Thank you, Tanya.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the PartsVu Xchange Talks Boating podcast. Is it almost time for routine maintenance on your outboard or Mercruiser marine engine? Check out our easy-to-use maintenance kits at PartsVu.com. And for free shipping, use the coupon code PVTalksBoating, a special perk for our podcast listeners. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram for boating knowledge, to keep in touch with the PartsVu community, and for special sales and promotions. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast, and check out the show notes for the coupon code just mentioned, more information about PartsVu and the products we offer, as well as our boating blog, the PartsVu Exchange. And a big thanks to Min for performing the original music featured within this podcast.